The stars were dying. One by one, they dimmed above the Cadian gate, their ancient fires swallowed by the black and violet churn of the Eye of Terror. It was not night that covered the heavens, but the devouring hunger of a wound in reality itself, a storm without end. In the shadow of that storm, the fortress world of Cadia stood as it always had, defiant, scarred, and unyielding. The wind across the parapets tasted of metal and ash, a reminder that this was a world where peace was not a memory, but a myth. Some say that on certain nights, if one stared long enough into the eye, one could see the faces of the dead, billions upon billions, crying out from within its swirling heart. Others said those were not the dead at all, but the visions of those yet to fall, glimpses of the doom awaiting all who dared stand against the will of the dark gods. Tonight, Lord Castellan Garyon Vale stood alone upon the highest bastion of Casa Mirac, and he did not need superstition to know what awaited them. He had seen it in the deployments, in the endless supply lines of warships that vanished into the void, and in the quiet conversations that ended when he entered the room. The galaxy was drawing its breath before the killing blow. But before we walk into that storm, before we set our feet upon the blood-worn stones of Cadia's last stand, let us speak plainly to one another, you and I. You have chosen to be here, to listen to the story of a world that could not be broken until it was ground to dust. We truly love and care for you for sharing in this tale, for walking with us through its sorrow and its fire. And now, before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The eye pulsed. Even at this distance, the great rent in space seemed alive, its swirling storms of madness shifting and churning like the slow turning of some immeasurable beast. Vale's eyes never left it. The great fortress cities below were quiet for now. The civilian districts shuttered, their inhabitants huddled in the underhives and blast shelters. Yet he knew that quiet was only the breath before the scream. He had learned long ago that wars were not won in the moment of impact. They were decided in the days and hours before, in the unspoken choices that commanders made when no one was watching. Once, long ago, Garyon Vale had believed in the simplicity of service. Orders were given. Orders were followed. Victory came to those who did their duty without hesitation. But service on Cadia had taught him a different truth. That duty was not the same as loyalty, and that loyalty was not the same as faith. And now, as the darkness gathered, he found himself asking questions he had never dared before. The comm feed at his wrist chimed softly, a coded priority signal. Vale did not answer immediately. He let the wind wash over him, carrying with it the distant hum of fortress shields and the faint crackle of the defense grid. That sound was Cadia's heartbeat, steady but fragile. Soon it would be drowned beneath the roar of guns and the screams of dying men. Finally, he pressed the rune. "Vale here," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Lord Castellan," came the reply, crisp and formal. It was Colonel Hest, his second in command. "We've had reports from the outer auger stations. Unidentified energy blooms along the trailing edge of the Cadian gate. Pattern suggests the first vanguard." So it begins, Vale thought. The opening faint. The smallest of the claws before the full weight of the beast descended. "Alert all bastions to full readiness," he said, "and tell the fleet we'll need orbital coverage within the hour." Hest hesitated, a rare thing for a soldier of Cadia. "Sir, the Inquisition's representatives are demanding a council before any mobilization orders are issued." Vale's jaw tightened. The Inquisition. Even now, With the eye itself breathing down their necks, they would demand ceremony and control. He could already picture Lady Severina Call, the Inquisitor assigned to oversee the defense of Cadia, her cold eyes and clipped words cutting through any pretense of shared purpose. "Tell the Inquisitor I will attend," Vale said at last, though the words tasted bitter. He looked once more to the eye. In the swirling storms, he thought he saw movement. Vast shapes like ships, or beasts, or both, gliding through the impossible depths. He could not tell if they were coming closer, or if they had always been there, waiting for Cadia to notice. He turned from the parapet and descended into the fortress. The air grew warmer as he passed through the shielded gates, the scent of oil and promethium replacing the cold tang of the wind. Servitors moved like shadows along the walls, checking power lines and gun servos. Soldiers drilled in silence, their faces set, their eyes already looking past the present moment into the shadow of what was coming. Vale walked among them, returning salutes with curt nods. These were not green conscripts. They were Cadians, born into war, trained from childhood to fight the horrors beyond the gate. They knew the cost of what was coming, and none of them turned away. That was the tragedy of Cadia. Not that it would fall, but that it had raised a people willing to die before they would yield. As he reached the strategium, the sound of voices met him, tense, sharp, and cutting. The doors parted, and the room fell silent as he entered. Lady Cole stood at the centre, her black rosette glinting under the strategium lights. The gathered officers shifted uneasily. "Lord Castellan," Cal said without preamble, "your forces will not mobilize to the outer bastions. You will instead commit them to securing a site beneath the central casa. My agents believe something there may prove decisive in the coming engagement." Vale said nothing for a long moment. His eyes flicked to the hololithic map of Cadia, where the outer bastions glowed red, already at risk. And in that moment, he felt it again. The pull between duty, loyalty, and faith. The sense that every step they took now would lead them closer to the grave. Above them, unseen, the first claws of the enemy fleet began to emerge from the air in the strategium hung heavy with unspoken tension. The glow of the hololith cast every face in cold, shifting light. Lines of crimson and amber tracing the fortress cities, the defense grid, the great bastions that had held for millennia. Lady Inquisitor Severina Cowell stood at its heart, her hands folded behind her back, her gaze fixed not on the fleet movements, but on the southern continent. "I will say it again, Lord Castellan." Cal's voice was sharp, clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Your orders are to commit 3 regiments to secure the vault beneath Casa Mirac. The asset there is of critical importance to the Imperium's future. Without it, we may as well surrender this world now." Vale's eyes narrowed. "That asset, Inquisitor, is nothing more than a rumor you refuse to explain. Meanwhile, the outer bastions will be hit first. If they fall, Cadia falls. Your vault will mean nothing when the skies burn." Cal's lips curved, not a smile, but a shadow of one. "You think too narrowly, Castellan. I serve the Imperium's survival, not the pride of one world. Sometimes the fall of a fortress is the only way to preserve the war." The words landed like cold iron. Officers shifted uneasily. Even Colonel Hest, usually as unflinching as the fortress walls, glanced away. Vale could feel the weight of every gaze on him. "I will not abandon my people," he said at last, his tone low and controlled. "Cadia stands. It has always stood. It will stand until the last man falls." Cole's eyes met his, unwavering. Then let us hope that last man's death means something greater than this rock stubbornness. She turned and strode from the room, her retinue of silent black-armored acolytes following in her wake. The door hissed shut behind her, leaving the strategium colder than before. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hest broke the silence. "Sir, shall I prepare the regiments for the vault operation?" Vale's jaw worked. He wanted to refuse outright, but the Inquisition's authority was absolute. Defiance could be as fatal as any enemy assault. "Prepare them," he said, each word edged with steel. "But we reinforce the bastions first. I will not hand the enemy our walls without a fight." Hest nodded and began issuing orders. Vale remained where he stood, staring at the hololith. The outer bastions flickered with their readiness statuses, but he could already sense the strain. There would not be enough men for both fronts. By the time Vale reached the drill yards, the regiments chosen for Call's mission were already assembling. Rows of Cadian shock troopers stood at attention, their armor worn but serviceable, their laser guns freshly charged. The banners of their kazas hung limp in the still air. It was here he found Sergeant Alaric Rain, one of the few soldiers Vale trusted beyond the thin veneer of official loyalty. Rain was younger than Vale by 2 decades, but his eyes bore the same 1,000-yard stare of a man who had fought on a dozen worlds. He was standing beside a Chimera transport, speaking quietly to his squad. "Sergeant," Vale called. Rain turned, saluted crisply, but did not mask the flicker of concern in his expression. "Orders, sir?" "You'll be leading the 122nd into the vault operation," Vale said. "Inquisitor's orders. I'm told it's important." Rain glanced toward the looming spire of Casa Myrick. "Important to her, maybe. The men think this is a distraction. You and I both know the first real fight will be at the bastions." Vale allowed himself a rare moment of candor. "You're right, but the Inquisition's reach is long. If she says this vault matters, we play along until we don't." That earned the faintest of smiles from Rain. "Understood, sir. We'll make it look convincing." The day's light was already fading when Vale returned to the command balcony overlooking the city. The fortress walls rose like mountains, their gun emplacements scanning the skies. Beyond them lay the dark expanse of the Cadian wastes, where only ash storms and the bones of long-dead wars remained. From here, Vale could see Sister Meredith moving among the civilian shelters below. The Sororitas had arrived only weeks earlier, a small contingent assigned to Cadia's defense by some distant decree. Her presence unsettled him, not because of her faith, but because of the way she spoke of Cadia's fate. In their first meeting, she had told him plainly, "Your walls will not fall to guns, Castellan. They will fall when the stone beneath them ceases to remember what it was built for." Tonight, she moved with quiet purpose, blessing the children and speaking to the old as if she were already delivering last rites. Vale turned away. He could not afford prophecy now, not when the augur relays were already screaming with the movement of enemy fleets. Night fell, and with it came the first reports of contact. Long-range augurs confirmed several Chaos raiding ships skirting the outer defenses, testing their reactions, probing for weaknesses. In the strategium, hollow displays updated with each movement, red icons sliding like blades toward Cadia's heart. Vale stood over the central display, hands clasped behind his back. Every movement was a piece on a board he could not afford to lose. And yet he felt the pull. Kull's vault on one side, the bastions on the other, and somewhere in the middle, the truth of what this siege was really about. He had commanded in countless wars, but never one where he felt so blind. And beyond it all, the eye of terror swelled, its sick light bathing the world in violet shadow. By midnight, orders were dispatched. The 122nd and 2 other regiments moved toward Casa Myrek's subterranean vaults, while the remainder of the fortress guard reinforced the bastion lines. The streets echoed with the rumble of armored columns and the steady tramp of boots. Civilians peered from darkened windows as their defenders marched past. Vale watched them go, his expression unreadable. Each step away from the walls made them more vulnerable. But each moment the Inquisition's will was delayed risked more than his own life. Somewhere deep in his gut, he knew this division of forces would cost them dearly. Above the city, far out in the void, something vast shifted within the eye. The first wave had begun its approach. The corridors beneath Casa Myrek were older than the city itself. Hewn from bedrock in the early days of Cadia's fortification, their walls were etched with sigils worn smooth by centuries of touch. Wards against the warp, the language of long-dead stonemasons, and the marks of regiments that had fought and died above these halls. Sergeant Rain led the 122nd through the gloom, their lasguns held ready, their steps echoing in the stale air. Servitor lamps flickered along the ceilings, throwing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "How far down does this place go?" Trooper Halvik asked under his breath. "Far enough to make you wish you'd stayed on the surface," Rain replied without turning. His voice carried no humor. At the rear of the column, Inquisitor Kull's personal guard moved in silence, their black carapace armor swallowing the light. Kull herself strode at the center, her eyes scanning each shadow as though she expected something to emerge at any moment. Vale's voice came over the Vox link, sharp and precise. "Rain, report. We're approaching the final descent," Rain replied. "No contacts. No sign of breach." "Keep your men tight," Vale said. "The augurs show increased warp resonance in your sector. Could be nothing. Could be everything." Above, the fortress city was a different world. The Stratium's walls hummed with data feed chatter, and the hololith flickered with the crimson movement markers of enemy probes. Vale moved between stations, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the bastion lines. Colonel Hest approached, his expression grim. "Outer Bastion 4 reports contact with Chaos forces. Light armor supported by infantry. They've requested air support." Vale frowned. "And the Navy?" "Still waiting on authorization from Battle Fleet Obscurus. They've committed most of their wings to intercepting raiders near the western flank." Vale's hand tightened on the railing. "Tell Bastion 4 to hold." "Reinforcements are en route." Hest hesitated. "With respect, sir, en route means 30 minutes. They'll be overrun in 10. Vale turned to meet his gaze. "Then they'll hold for 10. Cadia does not yield." The words tasted hollow, even as he said them. Deep in the vault corridors, the air grew colder. The walls shifted from rough stone to black, glassy material that drank in the light. The change was subtle at first, then overwhelming. "This isn't Imperial construction," Rain muttered to Kull as they entered a vast chamber. "No," Kull replied. "It is far older." In the center of the chamber stood a massive structure, a pylon of obsidian, studded with sigils that burned faintly in the dark. It was broken at the top, its jagged edge pointing toward the ceiling like an accusation. "This," Cole said, her voice low but resonant, "is a fragment of the Blackstone network, one of the oldest defenses Cadia possesses, and one of the most dangerous." Rain stepped closer, feeling a deep bone-level hum through his boots. "Dangerous to who?" "To everyone," Carl said simply. "Left untouched, it will continue to suppress the warp's reach into this system. But if we alter it, we can bend that suppression, focus it, turn it into a weapon." Rain didn't like the way she said, "alter." "And the Castellan knows about this." Carl's gaze was unreadable. "He knows enough." In the Strategium, Vale stood before the hololith. As Bastion 4's status icon blinked from green to amber, then red. Vox traffic screamed in the background. Reports of breach, close quarters fighting, evacuation of survivors. The Bastion had fallen. He turned away before the icon went dark. Every soldier there had known the cost, but it did not make the loss easier to bear. Sister Meredith entered the chamber quietly, her armor still carrying the dust of the shelters. "Another stone has forgotten its purpose," she said. Vale glanced at her sharply. "Is this prophecy, sister, or poetry?" "Both," she replied. "The pylons will not hold forever. They were never meant to. When they fall, the eye will open, and Cadia will be nothing more than a memory." Vale almost laughed, but it caught in his throat. "Then we make sure the memory is worth keeping." Back in the vault, Call's adepts began setting up strange equipment around the Blackstone fragment. Rain watched them work with growing unease. "What happens if this thing breaks?" he asked one of Carl's guards. The guard didn't look up. "If it breaks, Sergeant, you'll wish you died quickly." Hours later, Vale received Call's first status report. Her voice came through the Vox, measured, almost amused. "The artifact is secure. It will be ready when the time comes." Vale didn't answer immediately. He was watching the Bastion line, where 2 more icons had shifted to amber. When he finally replied, his voice was cold. "Then you had better pray that time comes before we have nothing left to defend." Above them, the eye of terror flared, an unnatural surge of light and shadow spilling across the void, as if it were listening. The siege had entered its 3rd week, and the walls of terror bled as though they were living flesh. Once, they had been the unbreachable skin of the Emperor's radiant empire, adamantium, ceramite, and the faith of billions forged into one unyielding shield. Now cracks spiderwebbed through the colossal ramparts. The enemy's guns spoke without pause, their bombardments shattering stone, steel, and spirit alike. The skies were a constant storm of fire. Orbital debris rained down, burning through the upper atmosphere as flaming streaks, each one a ruin of imperial glory. The faithful, huddled in their sanctuaries, watched these burning bodies with prayers on their lips, convinced they were angels falling to smite the heretic. The truth was far grimmer. They were the broken shells of ships that once protected mankind's cradle, now reduced to drifting corpses. Beneath the shattered heavens, the defenders clung to their posts with a ferocity born of desperation. The 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists, fought like the stone they had sworn to guard. Dawn's warriors did not yield a step, even when the ground beneath them ran black with blood. For every breach the enemy tore open, the Fists would meet it with bolter and blade, sealing the wound in the wall with their own bodies if they had to. And yet, behind every act of defiance lurked the shadow of doubt. Whispers ran through the ranks like poison. Word had spread that 3 of the Primarchs, brothers once sworn to the same oath, had turned upon the emperor. Names spoken in reverence only months ago now dripped with venom. Horus, Lorgar, Fulgrim. Their betrayal was not merely a wound in the flesh of the Imperium. It was a spear driven deep into its heart. In the great strategium of the Imperial Palace, Rogel Dawn stood hunched over the hololithic table. The light from the flickering projections cast him in pale gold, but even this light could not soften the edges of his grim features. Around him, his senior captains spoke in clipped tones, voices heavy with fatigue. "They're pressing the southern bastion again," said Captain Garradon, his gauntlets still blackened from powder and ash. "We've bled them there before. We can do it again." Dawn's gaze was like the edge of a blade, sharp, unwavering. "No," he said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of finality. "We cannot fight as we did before. Horus is not wasteful. Every assault, every push, every feint, they are all steps in a greater pattern. He will bleed us dry where we feel strongest." One of the remembrances, pale and trembling in the corner, scribbled the exchange onto parchment. These moments would one day become history, if there was anyone left to read it. Dawn's eyes turned to the map again, scanning the red-lit markers that represented enemy formations. "The southern bastion will hold without us. Our true battle is here." He gestured toward the inner sanctum, where the golden throne itself rested. "If the throne falls, terror falls, and if terror falls—" He left the thought unfinished. They all knew the truth. The Emperor's dream, the Great Crusade, all the blood spilled in the name of unity, it would die screaming. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of promethium and scorched flesh. Servitors dragged wreckage into makeshift barricades, their mechanical limbs jerking in graceless obedience. Civilians, their eyes wide with the haunted glaze of the condemned, shuffled in columns under the watchful eyes of the Adeptus Arbites. And yet, in the midst of this ruin, faith endured. Ecclesiarchal priests walked among the people, chanting litanies of hope. Their voices rose against the thunder of guns, calling out to the Emperor as though their devotion alone might shield them from the shells falling overhead. High above the carnage, the traitor fleet encircled terror like a steel noose. The once proud banners of the War Master hung from their prows, though many were defiled, daubed with the profane sigils of the dark gods. From orbit, they pounded the planet relentlessly, each strike another hammer blow on the anvil of imperial resolve. Horus's voice, transmitted through vox and warp echo alike, slithered into the minds of the defenders. His promises were sweet lies, cloaked in the language of brotherhood. "Lay down your arms. You have been betrayed by your master. Join me, and you will be spared the fate he has prepared for you." The weak listened, the weary considered, but the loyal stood firm. It was on the 21st day of the siege that the enemy made their boldest move yet. A concentrated assault on the Lion's Gate, a keystone to the palace's outer defences. The sons of Horus led the charge, their armour a deep sea green that gleamed under the flames. They came not as conquerors, but as executioners. The battle there was unlike any other. Titans strode across the field, their footfalls cracking the earth, their weapons boiling the air into molten storms. The air sang with lasfire, roared with bolter shells, and shrieked with the song of chain blades biting through armour. At the heart of the defence stood Dawn himself. The Primarch fought not as a distant commander, but as a warrior among his sons. His storm shield turned aside blow after blow, his power sword striking with the precision of a master artisan. Every motion was deliberate. Every strike carried the promise of death. And yet, even dawn could not be everywhere. A breach was forced, and for a terrible moment, it seemed the lion's gate would fall. But then came the thunder of drop pods, space marines of the blood angels and the white scars, striking like lightning into the heart of the enemy. For hours they fought, until the ground was slick with blood and the ruins were clogged with the dead. When at last the traitors fell back, they left behind a field of corpses so vast it seemed a new mountain had risen from the earth. Dawn stood amid the wreckage, his armor battered, his shield cracked. Around him, the defenders raised their voices in a ragged cheer. It was not the cheer of victory, but of survival. For now, Terra still stood, but the cracks in her armor grew wider with every passing hour. The siege was far from over, and even the most steadfast could feel the tide turning. The Emperor sat alone upon the obsidian throne of his private chamber, far from the sight of the custodians and the senators who still believed the Imperium was untouchable. Before him, the air shimmered with a faint aftertaste of psychic storms, the aftermath of 1,000 visions he had pulled into his mind. Each one was a future, a possible thread of fate, and in all of them, blood flowed through the marble streets of Terra. The siege had not yet begun, but he could feel its claws raking across the horizon of destiny. Reports reached him of unrest in the Segmentum Solar, of fleets that failed to return, of primarchs whose loyalty was now shadowed in doubt. The Emperor had spoken to each of his sons in private, but the words that once bound them together now seemed to fray in the winds of suspicion. A single custodian, clad in auramite, stepped forward. "Lord, the astropaths report." Silence. The eastern fringe has gone dark. His voice carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Silence in the void did not mean peace. Silence meant someone had torn the tongue from the Imperium's mouth. Beneath the palace, deep in the vaults that even the High Lords were forbidden to enter, ancient machines stirred. They were relics from before the Great Crusade, weapons too powerful or too cursed to ever be unleashed. The Emperor had sworn never to wake them, but he could already feel the decision pressing upon him like a blade at his neck. In the catacombs of the Adeptus Custodes, rituals began. Oaths were renewed, armor sanctified, and blades anointed in blood. The old war hymns, sung only in the darkest hours of the Imperium's history, echoed again through the palace walls. The custodians did not sing for victory. They sang to prepare their souls for the day they would die. Meanwhile, far above Terra's atmosphere, the Phalanx, the immense fortress ship of the Imperial Fists, adjusted its orbit. Rogel Dawn, ever the steadfast sentinel, walked its battlements, his mind a storm of calculation. He had already begun to reinforce the palace's walls, even as the Emperor insisted the threat was not yet at their door. But in the shadows beyond Mars, something ancient drifted closer. A fleet blacker than the void, its hulls etched with runes that had not been seen since the dawn of mankind. At its heart, a single ship the size of a city carried a presence that reached across the immaterium like a scream. Its captain had once stood by the Emperor's side. Now he came as his executioner. The Emperor's gaze shifted to the golden doors of his chamber. Soon he would call for Malcador, the Sigillite. Soon the plans laid in secret for centuries would be set in motion. And soon the sky over Terra would burn. Word count, 732. If you want, I can keep the pacing like this, tight, cinematic, but still epic, so that all chapters flow seamlessly into each other without losing the tragic grandeur. You said, Chapter 6. Complete Lico word, Count Poradena. ChatGPT said, Chapter 6, The Gathering Storm. The skies above Terra were deceptively serene, painted in hues of gold and crimson as the sun descended beyond the horizon. Yet beneath this beauty, the heart of the Imperium throbbed with unease. Across the endless sprawl of the Imperial Palace, alarms were being tested, garrison schedules doubled, and the air was thick with the iron tang of weapons freshly drawn from stasis vaults. Malcador the Sigillite stood upon a balcony high above the Hall of Apostles, his hood casting his lined face into shadow. In his hands, he held a data slate that glowed faintly in the dim light, a ledger of names. Every one of them was a loyal servant of the Emperor, marked for missions from which they would never return. His voice, low and deliberate, carried to the custodian standing nearby. "We are running out of time," Malcador murmured. "The outer systems are folding one by one, and those that do not fall turn their eyes away from us." In the vaults beneath the Astronomicon, the choir of psychers wailed as if in pain. The beacon that guided humanity's fleets across the stars still burned brightly, but the warp itself had grown treacherous. Strange tides surged through the immaterium, distorting visions and swallowing whole convoys. It was as if the sea of souls itself sought to drag mankind into the abyss. On Luna, the moon's fortress cities began their final preparations. Macro cannon barrels were swiveled toward the void, shields tested against phantom bombardments, and the first waves of volunteers took their places in defensive lines. They were mortals, most barely trained, but each bore the eagle of terror upon their breast with pride. They knew what was coming, even if the Imperial propaganda pretended otherwise. Rogel Dawn had convened his captains within the strategium of the phalanx. The great chamber glowed with tactical hololiths depicting the solar system. Colored markers for Imperial fleets blinked like fading stars, while the void beyond Saturn showed a growing shadow of red. Enemy warp signatures bleeding into real space. Dawn's voice was calm, but each word struck with the weight of stone. "They are coming," he said simply. "We cannot stop them from reaching us, but we can make them bleed for every step they take." Far from the palace, in the hidden black archives of the Officio Assassinorum, kill orders were issued without ceremony. Shadows moved among the underhives of terror, silencing suspected traitors before their whispers could become banners. None of these acts would ever be spoken of in imperial history, but they were as much a part of the defense as the walls themselves. And above it all, the Emperor stood at the pinnacle of the inner palace, eyes closed, hands resting upon the pommel of his blade. Through the warp, he felt the gathering of a storm unlike any in the history of mankind. He saw the black banners of his once loyal sons, the burning of the skies, the shattering of his dream. But he also saw something deeper, a faint glimmer of light, fragile yet unbroken. It was not victory he foresaw, nor survival. It was endurance. And in that endurance, the hope that humanity would rise again from the ashes. The hour was drawing near. The city burned beneath a crimson sky. Smoke coiled like the fingers of some vast and vengeful god, blotting out the sun until the streets lay in shadow. The air was thick with the tang of ash and the metallic sting of blood. Once, this place had been a jewel of the Imperium. Marble halls, golden spires, banners proclaiming the Emperor's dominion. Now, those same banners hung tattered, their sigils scorched and blackened by fire. From the high steps of the Forum Primaris, the Loyalists made their stand. Their armor was dented and scorched, their bolters running low on ammunition, but their eyes still burned with defiance. They knew the truth. There would be no rescue, no relief force. The traitors had closed the noose, and the city was doomed. Yet to yield was unthinkable. Down the avenue marched the enemy. Their armor was painted in the colors of betrayal, their heraldry defaced with blasphemous sigils. Their leader strode at the fore, his helm shaped into a leering skull, a relic of some forgotten campaign. His vox-amplified voice carried above the crackle of flames. "Loyal dogs, your master cannot save you. Lay down your arms, and perhaps I will grant you the mercy of a swift death." No one moved. Not a single warrior lowered his weapon. The first shots rang out, a single bolt shell that found its mark in the chest of a traitor sergeant. The impact blew the man's torso apart in a burst of gore and ceramite fragments. Then the world erupted into chaos. Bolters barked, laser-guns hissed, and the traitors surged forward like a living tide. Brother Captain Kalen fought at the forefront, his power sword wreathed in a haze of blue lightning. He cut down one foe, then another, his blade carving arcs of light through the smoke. Around him, his brothers held the line, their war cries defiant even as the enemy pressed harder. But for every traitor slain, 3 more seemed to take his place. On the western wall, the defenders' line buckled. A breach was forming, the ancient masonry crumbling under the relentless pounding of siege guns. Kalen's vox bead crackled with desperate reports. Civilians being slaughtered in the lower districts, traitor drop pods landing in the plaza, enemy artillery walking closer with every salvo. The city's death was no longer a question of if, only when. A sudden roar split the air. The gates of the forum exploded inward, hurled aside as if by a giant's hand. Through the breach came one of the enemy's champions, a towering figure clad in war-plate black as midnight. His weapon was a massive chain axe, its teeth shrieking as it carved through the first defenders to meet him. Kalen met the charge head-on. The clash was titanic. Sparks flying as power field met whirring adamantine teeth. The champion's blows were heavy enough to crack stone, but Kalen moved with the precision of a duelist, turning aside each strike by a hair's breadth. For a moment, the battle seemed to slow, the rest of the world fading to the sound of their weapons clashing. Then came the pain. The champion fainted, then drove his knee into Kalen's chest with bone-breaking force. Ribs cracked, breath fled, and Kalen stumbled. In that heartbeat, the chain axe came down, only for Kalen to twist, the teeth biting deep into his pauldron instead of his neck. He answered with a riposte, his blade finding the traitor's side and spilling boiling blood across the stones. The champion fell, roaring his defiance to the last. Kalen had no time to savor the victory. The breach widened, and more traitors poured in. The forum steps became a killing ground, bodies piling high as the loyalists fought with the desperation of the damned. In the distance, bells began to toll, not for victory, for the dead. Kalen looked up at the blood-red sky and knew the truth. The Emperor's light was fading here. This was not the end of the war, but it was the end of this city, and they would burn with it rather than kneel. "For terror," he roared, and his brothers answered as one. The traitors came on, and the sky above Terra was not the clear, starless veil it had been for millennia. Now it burned. Great rivers of light and shadow swirled like wounded serpents, and the heavens screamed under the strain. The celestial gate, the vast, God-forged portal linking the imperial palace to the webway, shuddered in its frame of gold and adamantium. Every rune etched into its colossal arch flared violently, struggling against the tide of corruption pressing in from the other side. The Emperor had envisioned the gate as humanity's triumph over the limitations of the warp, a doorway to the stars free from the claws of demons. But now, in the dying hours of the Golden Age, it had become a beacon for the horrors it was meant to keep out. Warriors stood in their thousands before it, custodians clad in auramite plate, their guardian spears burning with killing light. Sisters of silence, their presence a silent balm against the screaming tide of psychic malice. Behind them, legions of Imperial Army soldiers formed grim ranks, their faces pale, beneath the shadow of what was to come. And far above them, at the summit of the palace walls, the Emperor himself stood, his radiance muted by strain, his eyes, pools of endless gold, fixed upon the rippling surface of the gate. A voice echoed across the gate, not with sound, but with thought. Father. The name was drenched in mockery. From the depths of the webway came a figure in blackened armor, his every step cracking the marble floor. His helm was a snarling beast visage, his gauntlets dripping with embers of the warp. He was no stranger to the throne world. Once he had been its champion. Now he came as its executioner. Horus. The Primarch's voice was smooth, almost gentle. You should never have built this door, Father. You should never have dreamed so loudly. The Emperor did not reply. His silence was heavier than words, his stillness the calm before a world's destruction. The first blow fell without warning. Horus swung his taloned fist into the arch of the gate, and the very air tore like rotting cloth. A wave of impossible force surged outward, flinging soldiers aside like leaves in a storm. Screams rose as the edges of reality split, and shapes began to pour through, things of shadow and madness, their bodies both there and not, their eyes burning with hunger older than suns. The custodians moved first. Golden figures charged, their spears punching through demons that burst apart in showers of ichor and screaming vapor. The sisters followed, their null auras turning the closest warp things into howling ash. But for every one that fell, 3 more emerged. The Emperor raised his hand. The air between him and the gate hardened, turning into a wall of blinding light. The demons recoiled, their forms smoking, their shrieks sharp enough to crack stone. For a moment, the tide faltered. Then Horus stepped through. The golden wall split around him as if it feared to touch him. He moved with the certainty of a god who had already won. Every step he took toward the Emperor was a hammer blow against the morale of those who watched. You cannot hold it forever, Horus said. You cannot hold me forever. The Emperor's voice was quiet, but it filled every mind. You speak as though I mean to hold you. I will end you. They met in a flash of force that could have shattered continents. Horus's claw raked against the master of mankind's blade of purest light, the clash sending ripples through the very fabric of the palace. Marble split. Banners tore themselves to shreds, and the sky screamed louder. Around them, the battle became slaughter. The imperial lines bent, broke, and were reforged in blood. Custodians fell, impossible as it seemed, dragged down by sheer weight of numbers. Sisters of silence were torn apart by claws they could not see. The air became a storm of gore and warp fire. The Emperor pressed Horus back, each blow driving sparks of gold and shadow into the air. But Horus fought with the strength of 10,000 damned worlds. Every strike was a betrayal, every parry a reminder of the son he had once loved. And then cracks appeared in the gate itself. Not fractures of stone or metal, but wounds in reality. They bled light and darkness in equal measure. From them, greater shapes began to emerge, things too vast for mortal minds to endure. Their voices were the songs of dead galaxies, their laughter the grinding of collapsing stars. The Emperor broke from the duel for only an instant, his hand raised toward the gate. Power surged from him in a golden flood, stitching the wounds closed. But even as he did, Horus struck. The blow landed with the force of a falling moon, hurling the Emperor backward across the marble steps. Gasps rose from the Imperial defenders. For a heartbeat, it seemed the master of mankind had fallen. Horus advanced, the shadows around him coiling like serpents, his smile a wound in the world. But the Emperor stood again, and this time his light flared brighter than the burning sky. "You will not pass this gate," he said. And then he moved, not as a man, but as the storm itself. The last sight many warriors saw before death took them was the two titans locked in combat at the foot of the celestial gate. Gold against black, light against shadow, father against son. The battle for Terra's soul roared on. But here, before this door between worlds, the fate of the Imperium teetered on the knife edge of eternity. The fires rose higher. The sky above the Imperial Palace burned like the last light of a dying sun. War had turned the heavens into a canvas of fire and ash, where orbital debris fell like falling stars, and the screams of the wounded mingled with the thunder of cannon fire. The final walls that separated the Emperor's sanctum from the enemy were crumbling, their once proud bastions cracked by weeks of relentless bombardment. On the walls, the defenders stood in silence before the next assault. Space Marines of shattered legions, custodians in their dented auramite, and mortal soldiers clad in blood-stained flak armor. Each knew that this would be their last watch. The faces beneath their helms and visors bore the same expression, grim acceptance. They were no longer fighting for survival, but to buy minutes, perhaps even seconds, for the Emperor to finish his work. Among them walked Lord Commander Valan, a veteran of the Great Crusade, his armor carved with the scars of 1,000 battles. The sigils of his chapter were barely visible beneath layers of soot and blood. He carried no illusions. He had watched entire companies burn away in the fires of Horus's heresy. Yet still, he moved among the ranks, a silent pillar that refused to fall, for if the men saw him break, they too would falter. Below, in the shattered no-man's land, the enemy was mustering. The legions of chaos, once the Emperor's most loyal sons, formed ranks amid the wreckage of tanks and bodies. Their banners torn and blackened, still carried the corrupted symbols of their primarchs. The air shimmered with the presence of demons, shadows that seemed to breathe, their eyes like burning coals. When the first horns sounded, the defenders tightened their grips on bolters and blades. There was no rousing speech, no grand gesture, only the thunderous roar of guns opening fire as the enemy surged forward. Bolter shells tore through the first waves, but for every heretic slain, 2 more took their place. The air filled with the stink of promethium and burning flesh. The fighting became hand-to-hand upon the walls. Chainsword screamed, power weapons crackled, and the clash of ceramite on ceramite rang out beneath the thunder of the guns. Custodians fought like demigods, each swing cutting down traitors by the score, but even they bled beneath the tide. Lord Commander Valan found himself face to face with an enemy champion clad in the armor of a lunar wolf, its white and grey now turned to corpse black. Their duel was brutal, neither yielding until Valan's blade found the heretic's throat. Yet, as he tore his weapon free, another took the fallen's place. Hours passed in a haze of slaughter. The defenders were pushed back to the inner gates, their numbers dwindling. Mortals fought beside post-human giants, their courage the only weapon they still possessed. Even the wounded refused to leave, fighting from where they had fallen. As night fell over Terra, the last watch still stood, reduced to a handful of bloodied warriors. Valen looked once more to the burning horizon and thought of the Emperor upon his golden throne. There was no hope for victory, but hope had long since ceased to matter. Their duty was all that remained, and so, when the next horn of the enemy sounded, the defenders raised their weapons one final time. The halls of the imperial palace had once been alive with voices, the measured tones of the administratum, the sacred chants of the ecclesiarchy, the crisp reports of the legions. Now, in the final days, those voices had dwindled to a whisper, and in the highest spires there was only one sound, the silent choir. They were psychers, hundreds of them, gathered in endless circles upon circles, their bodies locked in positions of agony, their eyes rolled back to stare into a sky that only they could see. Their song was not made of sound, but of thought, an unbroken psychic beacon, pushing back the warp storms that raged at the very edges of Terra's reality. Without them, the final walls of the Emperor's realm would fall in hours. But the song was killing them. One by one, the psychers' voices were extinguished in the immaterium, their bodies collapsing where they sat. For every one who died, another was dragged into place, chained, and forced to join the psychic hymn. The air in the chamber was thick with incense to mask the stench of sweat, blood, and burnt nerves. At the center of the choir stood a figure robed in gold, Malcador, the sigillite. His gaunt face was a death mask, yet his eyes burned with the cold fire of duty. He had been here for days without rest, guiding the psychic resonance like a conductor holding together an orchestra of the damned. Through the veil, the choir felt the enemies pressing close. Demon armies that howled without mouths, void ships that sailed on seas of madness, traitor psychers screaming prayers to their new gods. Every note of the hymn was a blade in the warp, cutting a narrow path for the loyal fleet still limping home to Terra. But Malcador knew this could not last. Each hour cost 100 lives. Each day brought the song closer to collapse. In a rare moment of stillness, one of the younger psychers turned her mind toward him and whispered without words, "Regent, why do we sing if the end cannot be stopped?" Malcador did not answer immediately. He closed his eyes and let the thought drift into the weave of the choir. Because the Emperor must have his chance. Even if the dawn never comes, we will hold the night for him. Outside, the sky over Terra burned with auroras of unnatural light, the visible bleeding of the warp into reality. And in the shadow of the palace, the armies of both man and monster gathered, preparing for the siege. The choir sang on. The Lion's Gate spaceport had been many things in the history of the Imperium. A proud monument to the Emperor's mastery of engineering, a choke point of interstellar commerce, a beacon of civilization in the darkness. Now, it was a battlefield waiting to ignite. From the upper terraces, the whole plain of the Lion's Gate could be seen. Tier upon tier of adamantium fortifications, each bristling with macro cannon emplacements, void shields, and siege artillery. Behind those walls stretched the causeways to the Eternity Gate itself, the final threshold to the Imperial Palace, beyond which lay the Emperor's sanctum. The defenders knew what was coming. They had seen the traitor fleets gathering in the void like a black tide, their silhouettes blotting out the stars. They had heard the rumors that the War Master himself would lead the assault, that the legions who had once sworn to defend humanity were now sworn to its destruction. The Imperial Fists manned the ramparts in silent ranks, their yellow armor weathered and scarred from campaigns that had already cost them dearly. Their Primarch, Rogel Dawn, moved among them without ceremony. His presence was not a rallying cry. It was a promise, as unyielding as the stone beneath their boots. The gates would not fall while a single Imperial Fist drew breath. Alongside them stood regiments of the Solar Auxilia, their plasteel armor gleaming dully in the harsh light of the palace. The air was thick with the scent of machine oil and ozone from the freshly charged weapons. Tech priests moved between the lines, blessing the guns with Binharik Kant and checking the spirit of each war engine. In the skies, above, wings of lightning and thunderbolt fighters roared past in tight formation, their pilots knowing that when the traitor fleets entered low orbit, theirs would be the first lives spent. From the parapets, dawn surveyed the horizon. A smear of darkness spread along the edge of the world, the leading edge of the enemy fleet breaking atmosphere. Already, the ground shook from the impact of their drop pods and landers striking far beyond the outer lines. The war was moving from the void to the very soil of terror. Dawn spoke only once before the first shells began to fall. Men and women of the Imperium, you stand at the wall. Behind you is your home. Behind you is your Emperor. You will not take one step back. The first impacts ripped through the far bastions, turning walls to shrapnel and bodies to smoke. Vox nets filled with the roar of orders, the screams of the dying, and the steady voice of commanders holding the lines. The gates of eternity had opened before to welcome pilgrims, dignitaries, and the emperors chosen. Now they would be a doorway into hell itself. The bombardment began at dawn, though on Terra, the concept of dawn had lost all meaning. The skies above the Lion's Gate were no longer blue nor golden. They were a bruised and bleeding grey, choked with the exhaust of engines and the smoke of 1,000 burning districts. From orbit, the traitor fleet unleashed its wrath. Cyclonic torpedoes struck with enough force to level mountain ranges. Barrages of mass drivers turned whole defense bastions into craters before their defenders could even fire a shot. Where the macro batteries fell silent, squadrons of heretic strike craft screamed down to strafe the walls with lasfire and bombs. The defenders endured. Rogel Dawn walked the ramparts under fire, his armor dusted with ash and debris, his voice a calm constant over the Vox. Around him, the Imperial Fists fought with the precision of a fortress's gears. Squads shifting to reinforce crumbling sectors, heavy weapon emplacements spitting death into the sky, until they were overrun or destroyed. The Solar Auxilia manned the inner lines, each regiment holding its assigned bastion to the last. Some bastions ceased transmitting within minutes of the bombardment's start. Others endured for hours before the traitor guns silenced them. Each loss was a knife to Dawn's iron will, but his orders never faltered. Every moment bought in the outer lines was a moment closer to survival for the palace. Among the enemy ranks, banners of the traitor legions appeared through the haze. The Eye of Horus, the burning skull of the World Eaters, the Hydra of the Alpha Legion. All heralded the arrival of warriors once sworn to defend Terra. They advanced beneath the cover of their bombardment, their armor blackened from re-entry, their bolters already raised. When the first breach came, it was like a wound tearing open in the wall. The bombardment had reduced one of the Lion's Gate bastions to a skeletal ruin, and through that gap poured the first wave of traitor Astartes. the sons of Horus themselves, their green armor dulled to almost black, their eyes glowing with malice. The imperial fists met them head-on. Bolter fire tore through the air in deafening volleys, chainsword screamed, and the clash of ceramite against ceramite rang across the courtyard. Above, Thunderhawk gunships darted in and out of the smoke, their heavy bolters scything through squads of traitors before being driven back by return fire. The ground shook with the impact of dreadnoughts wading into the melee, their fists smashing walls and men alike. The ashen sky did not clear. It grew darker. The longer the fighting raged, the thicker the air became with the detritus of war. Ash, smoke, the metallic tang of blood atomized by explosions. By nightfall, if night could be told from day, the outermost bastions of the Lion's Gate lay in ruins. Thousands of defenders were dead, the walls choked with their bodies, and yet the inner defenses still held, the guns still roared, and dawn still stood, unbowed. The price of every inch of ground was blood, oceans of it, and the traitors had only begun to pay. The sky above Terra was a tapestry of ash and embers, a false dawn that heralded no sunrise. Across the walls of the imperial palace, the defenders fought on in silence. The silence of men and women who knew that their end was no longer a matter of if, but when. The enemy had breached too many gates, shattered too many bastions. Hope had become a relic, like the statues buried beneath rubble. It was in this desperate hour that the Twilight Pact was formed. In the deepest crypts beneath the palace, where the air was heavy with dust and the memory of forgotten oaths, a council gathered, not of equals, but of the last remnants of the Emperor's chosen. They were warriors, scholars, psychers, and even broken remnants of the Mechanicum, all bound by one understanding. The throne could not be saved in its entirety, but fragments of the dream might yet endure. Malcador stood at the head of the chamber, his face a pale ruin from unending strain. His voice was hoarse as he spoke. The Emperor's body will remain, but his will must be carried forward. If Terra burns, then somewhere far from here, the ember must be kept alive. Some among them called it betrayal, to think of retreat, to speak of exile while the master of mankind yet fought. But Malcador's gaze silenced them. Even the most stubborn among them could see that the walls were closing in. They would fight, yes, but they would also prepare for what would come after. The pact was sealed in blood, as was ancient custom. Hidden vaults were opened, revealing relics and data vaults, seeds of knowledge, fragments of technology, and psychic echoes that might one day rekindle civilization. Warriors volunteered for the unthinkable, to vanish into the void, taking with them these fragments of mankind's legacy. They would not live to see victory, only the possibility of survival. Above, the palace shook with the roar of bombardment. The enemy's banners could be glimpsed through the smoke. Still, in that shadowed hall, the last stewards of humanity clasped forearms and made their vow. If we fall, the dream will not die with us. Outside, the night deepened, and the final storm gathered. The pact would not save Terra, but it might save humanity's soul. The walls of the Imperial Palace had been built to withstand the fury of the galaxy. The massed batteries of alien fleets, the pounding of macro cannons, the relentless assault of siege engines. But nothing in the long history of Terra had prepared them for this. The enemy came not as a tide, but as a great and endless storm. From the blasted horizon, their legions surged forward in waves, each one breaking upon the battlements only to be replaced by another, larger, more frenzied than before. Siege towers clawed their way through craters, pushed by engines of iron and flesh. Demonic artillery tore holes in reality itself, vomiting screaming projectiles into the defenders' lines. At the Lion's Gate, the mightiest of all the palace entrances, the ground trembled under the step of colossal siege constructs, war engines older than human memory, their hulls etched with runes of damnation. Upon the parapets, imperial fists manned their stations with grim resolve, every bolt round fired with the precision of desperation. The air reeked of promethium and ozone, and the stone itself seemed to weep under the strain. For days, the defenders had turned back the tide, but on the 43rd hour of the 7th day, the breach came. A single, thunderous impact, the sound of the world breaking. As the gate's adamantium spine split, a wave of enemy infantry poured through, shrieking their victory, their weapons glowing with unholy fire. Sigismund, first captain of the imperial fists, stood at the forefront, his blade carved arcs of gold in the blood haze, his voice a roar over the din. Hold! Hold until the emperor himself commands you to fall. But even as his words rang out, the breach widened. The defenders fought in narrowing circles, the press of bodies and smoke suffocating every breath. Far above Terra's sky was a nightmare canvas. Titanic shapes clashing in low orbit, debris raining down like meteors. The void shields flickered, fires spread unchecked. The roar of battle became a single constant note, like the heartbeat of a dying god. And then, the final insult. The great gates, symbols of imperial invincibility, gave way entirely. They fell inward with a scream of tearing metal, crushing friend and foe alike beneath their ruin. The enemy's banners surged forward, blotting out the light. The palace still stood, but its doors were open to the dark. What came next would not be a siege. It would be slaughter. The Lion's Gate had fallen, and with it, a piece of the emperor's dream. Inside the palace walls, the enemy's war host poured like a river of fire, their banners snapping in the poisoned wind, their war cries blending with the tortured shrieks of the dying. What had once been the sanctum of mankind's hope now echoed with the sound of bolter fire, the clash of chain blades, and the inhuman howls of demons freed from the leash of reality. The inner courtyards became killing grounds. Space Marines fought in tight formations, their armor scorched, their movements slowed by exhaustion and wounds that would have felled lesser men hours before. Every step back was paid for with blood. The golden tiles beneath their boots ran slick with gore, and the air choked with the copper stench of death. Sigismund fought at the fore once more, every stroke of his sword carving a path through the press. His armor was rent and blackened, his breathing ragged, yet his eyes burned with the clarity of a man who knew the end was coming, and would meet it standing. Behind him, custodians formed an unbreakable wall of gold, their guardian spears glowing in the smoke. They fought not for life, but to buy seconds, each heartbeat a gift to those racing to secure the inner sanctum. Far above the chaos, the spires of the palace still glittered, but the light was false, cast by fires and explosions. Gunships roared overhead, dueling in low passes. The echo of macro batteries thundered in the distance as the outer districts were reduced to rubble, the enemy's advance leaving nothing untouched. In the Hall of Heroes, where statues of the Great Crusade's champions lined the marble, the fighting grew desperate. Demon princes tore through stone effigies with contempt, their talons rending Astarte's plate as though it were parchment. Librarians fought with their minds aflame, psychic lightning burning entire waves of foes before they themselves were torn apart. The steps leading toward the Sanctum Imperialis became the final choke point. Here, the defenders planted their feet. Here, they drew a line in blood. The ground was littered with broken helms and shattered banners. The screams of the wounded were drowned in the thunder of bolters and the grinding roar of chainfists. Through the smoke, the enemy's champions advanced. Towering figures in warped armor, their weapons dripping with the essence of slain heroes. They sought not simply to win, but to humiliate, to desecrate. Each step they took toward the throne was an insult to the dreams of 10,000 years. And yet, the defenders did not yield. Even as the walls shook and the sky wept fire, even as the palace's gates lay in ruins, they fought with a fury that no mortal army could match. Because they knew the truth. This was not merely the defense of a fortress. This was the defense of the soul of mankind. By nightfall, the steps to the throne were carpeted in corpses. Friend and foe indistinguishable in the ruin, the enemy had taken ground, but at such cost that even their champions paused. For a single, fragile moment, the tide held, but the night was not yet over, and in the deepest heart of the palace, the emperor stirred.